Welcome to Wednesday Web Chat. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision 33. And my guest today is Carlos Aparicio. And Carlos is going to be talking to us about end-of-life issues as it centers around our systems and what we need to do about that and how we should think about that. So, Carlos, we welcome you back to Wednesday Web Chat this week. It's been a while. We try to get you in here about at least once a year to have a little word with folks about, call it hardware and systems issues. I'd like to thank you for doing that. And today we're going to be talking about end of life.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about end of life, and Carl, as usual, just keep the dialogue going, between the two of us, and feel free to stop me at any time. Otherwise, I tend to ramble on a little bit. So appreciate you popping in whenever you've got a question. So
Will do.
like anything else, Carl, sooner or later everything kind of reaches a tipping point, and that includes technology. Everything has an expiry date. And end of life is when a manufacturer stops developing and servicing the product. And I think the key there is, the servicing of the product. The development, a lot of times people could say, I'm happy with the tools that I've got in there right now, or the features and functionality that I have. I'm good with that. But it's the servicing of the product that can be challenging. And this can include, things such as technical support, upgrade, bug fixes, and most importantly, in today's day and age, we're really talking about security and what that means to an end user or an end user's system. And everything from underlying OS upgrades are included in our cloud offering. So meaning that some of that is taken away, but it's important that everybody understands that whether you're managing your own infrastructure or that role is relied upon by someone else, you really should be aware that it's important that those upgrades, those patches, those security patches, especially, you've been around long enough that Microsoft Patch Tuesday has become a bit of a misnomer or punchline for a lot of conversations in the technology field. So that's really what it's about. It's Patch Tuesday, which is a big Microsoft one, but it really revolves around everything, whether it's your underlying OSs, like in this case, Microsoft, Linux, but including your SAP. You started off the conversation by informing us of the latest version and patches that are SAP compliant that we're recommending. It's important that you keep those up to date as often as possible. Okay.
Carlos, you mentioned there's something that I think is still today, although it's changing over the years, call it the historical collection of customers that Vision 33 has. Most of them, as I said, although it's changing, moving towards the cloud rapidly, they're still on premises. And this concept of the operating system, the ERP version, the hardware, all of those things needing to sort of be able to exist together, that seems to have become a bigger challenge over the years. Would you say that's true?
Yes, absolutely. There's so many moving parts, Carl, that all of those, what you referred to, are the interdependencies of each of those moving pieces. And in today's day and age of ERP, there are so many. It's like you said, of course, the big stack, which is infrastructure, what hardware you're running it on. And again, irrelevant of whether that's a Dell server or Lenovo server from an infrastructure perspective, or even cloud infrastructure such as AWS or Azure. There's still some interdependencies there. What OSs then are layered on top of that, like Microsoft Server, like SQL Server, like Linux? Those are all interdependent on the hardware, and the hardware is interdependent of the software. Then, of course, there's the SAP versions as well, which I'll have a slide at the end to kind of show some of that interdependencies and how they're related to each other. Because at the end of the day, they all have a life expectancy, but they're interdependent of each other. So they have to move together, which I think is the key to what you just mentioned. Having them move together is important.
I think it's a huge challenge. Just a little bit of personal history. Before you got on, I was talking with Vina, who's behind the scenes, about how long I've been doing this. When I first started doing Wednesday web chats, the vast majority of our customers were running Microsoft SQL and ran their entire system on one server.
That's right.
And many of them, there are some that still can, but very few. And would you say that most Business One customers today probably have three servers?
I would say at minimum they have three servers, and that's a really key point. Is that the workloads, especially in the day and age of what we call virtualization, right? In other words, you can have one local host, a physical box, and then within that one box, you can have multiple virtual machines depending on the resources, and that's what allows you to have more of a defined workload for those virtual machines. For example, you have with something called a presentation server, which is the way I log into the environment. Then we have the application server, which is where some add-ons can be added and the B1 client runs. And then there's the database server. So that's where you're referring to the three. So at
Yep.
minimum, that would be ideally the recommendation is to have those three servers. Now it's not a cookie cutter. In other words, it's not one size fits all, but that would be ideally a great way to plan your deployment. Absolutely.
And one last comment from me, just a
Yep.
question really from a historical perspective. The advent of how much we have over the last decade sort of transitioned to relying on the internet and integrating with cloud applications, and the advent of the SAP HANA database. Have those things added to this end of life puzzle, shall we call it?
Yes, because there are now more ingredients in the soup to mix, right? So more things to consider, more interdependencies than there have ever have been. And as you well know, add-ons or third-party SSPs involvement in writing applications and functionality for B1 just exacerbate that. More moving pieces, like you, telling our age, when we first started, everything was fairly vanilla, we'll call it.
Yeah.
The additional pieces and functionality, which are amazing and needed, that are added to B1 and the SAP B1 stack, add to that complexity and those interdependencies. And I think it's more than ever, as you're alluding to, is it's important that we stay on top of these things, that we stay current or as current as possible, just so that we address functionality, but also the security aspect of it. And as you know, publishers are always improving their code, their functionality, things that they would have liked to have done better at original release. They then go on and improve at a later release. So it's important that all of these things be kept up to date. And because it becomes cumulative, which I think is something that sometimes people miss out on, is that they think, oh, I'm not going to upgrade to the next one and I'll just wait till the next one. And that becomes a bit of a trend. And by the time they actually go to address it, there are so many things that need to be addressed that they almost are starting, I don't want to say from ground zero, but if you wait long enough, that is where you're starting, is we're
Yeah, and
starting
it
from ground zero.
it complicates the overall issue
Absolutely.
if you skip too many opportunities.
No,
For sure.
totally agree. Totally
Well,
agree.
thank you for helping us get a little bit of
Yeah.
historical perspective on that as well.
Yeah, no problem. So I'll just continue with my slides and I'll try to talk quickly through them. And then at the end, I think is the important ones, but we'll see if I can get them up here. Here we go. End of life product or software is at the end of life cycle, which prevents users from receiving, like we've just talked about, some of these things we've already talked about. So I'll kind of go through quickly. It stops the users from receiving updates indicating that the product is end of life and useful life according to the vendor or the publisher. From their point of view, it's like they've moved on. They move on to the next and greatest version, and that's what they're going to be supporting moving forward. At this stage, all the vendor software updates and support end. All users can continue accessing the discontinued product, but the system can't receive security or patches, updates, and technical support. Now, at Vision 33, with our total care, it's important that our customers realize we will continue to support whatever system you're on for as long as we possibly can with best efforts. In other words, we'll use our internal knowledge and expertise to resolve any issues or provide any guidance as to how to overcome any issues you're encountering. The issue can become more exacerbated, as I discussed earlier, when we have to go to those vendors or those publishers to provide support, and they'll say, this version is no longer supported, and that may lead to some roadblocks. But it's important, I think, and key that customers understand that Vision 33 customers will always be supported regardless of what version they're on from a Vision 33 perspective. I think that's very important. The big things of why ignoring end of life time is a bad idea. The big one is the security vulnerability, and that comes down to no more security fixes being issued by the system authors or publishers. And as I discussed earlier, oftentimes publishers build a piece of software and then realize at a later point that should have been done a little bit differently, could have been done a little bit better, and they provide patches or fixes on an ongoing basis. And like I said, Microsoft being the big one, but all publishers do this. And because of end of life, they stop looking at that and do not provide OS or security updates, and that can be a security hazard. For this reason alone, you should be updated as soon as possible. Things as like your firewall, antivirus aren't sufficient to protect against unpatched vulnerabilities, which make quite easy for hackers to exploit. Okay, in today's day and age of ransomware, hacking, phishing, all of these terms that we use from a security vulnerability perspective, our first line of defense is to make sure that we have the latest and greatest patches, security fixes that publishers put out. Okay. The other is software and compatibility. This is what we're talking about, interdependencies, where new applications are optimized for the most recent OSs. That means that when using end-of-life operating systems, you can't upgrade to the latest and greatest, so you have to hold on to legacy applications, which are likely also end-of-life soon to be. So that's the key to staying on top of things, like we talked about, where you can take smaller steps as opposed to having to take one large step, and that can be a much easier step to take. Compliance issues for industries that are regulated, like healthcare, e-commerce, and that deal with a lot of sensitive data, that can become a stumbling block as well. Poor performance reliability as well. Like I mentioned, publishers are always looking to improve that, and they take advantage of any new kind of underlying upgrades that occur on the OSs, and the publisher will then take advantage of that. And that even goes for things like Microsoft Server. If a new Intel chip comes out, as an example, Microsoft will try to write code that is specific to that chip to take advantage of that new technology that they have. Just a quick example of vulnerability in an end-of-life operating system that was exploited successfully back in 2017. It was a massive cyber attack, and it was called the WannaCry exploit. Some of you may have heard of it. It was used to target hundreds of thousands of companies that were still using Windows XP. And this is 2017. It's important that we understand that end of life for Windows XP was 2014. So full 3 years later, hundreds of thousands of computers were infected in a variety of different countries. So 3 years later, hundreds of thousands of computers were still using an end-of-life system. I hate to use the word pandemic, but it is a pandemic from a technology perspective, that users don't upgrade. Users don't see the risk. And hopefully, as part of this discussion, it'll enlighten some people in our audience into saying, I should really be thinking about this. And these two slides, we're going to see if we can post these. And what these are is just some dates on what ends when. And I won't go into the details, but it's Windows Server, which is what all servers require from a deployment perspective. These are the underlying what we call OSs. So, we've talked about SQL, we've talked about HANA. HANA sits on an OS called SUSE Linux. And the versions are there, and we can see that Server 2008 R2 is expired, come to end of life 2020. The next big one to come to end of life will be 2012 R2, and that's coming to end of life in October of 2023. So you can see some of the dates there. The SUSE Linux versions end much more quickly, have a shorter window. And that's because something inside of called the kernel gets changed more often. And so the next slide shows the interdependencies within SAP B1. And this is specifically, what are the interdependencies for the Windows Server, the SQL, and the SAP B1. So I'll just pick an SAP version. We'll call it version 10, and we'll call it 2202, which is the version that you mentioned that we're on right now. And you can see from the bars below that it's compliant all the way back to 2016 and currently 2019. 2022 is out. Unfortunately, hasn't been certified yet. Soon to be for SQL, but you can see that Windows, the server portion, already is compliant to 2022, and it's still compliant with 2012 R2 for the latest version B110. And so hopefully you can follow that graph, and it'll give you an opportunity to see what's compliant, what's not compliant, where you stand. And I think it's important that, from a Vision 33 perspective, we're here to support our customers. If you're not sure, reach out to your local customer relationship manager, your CRM, and they'll be able to talk through with you this. So the only difference between this slide and the previous slide is that this is SUSE and HANA as opposed to Windows and SQL. Okay, and we can see version 10, 2202, and what it's compliant with, which is SP2 and SP3 for SLES 15. And I know the versions are a little bit different for Linux. I still have a hard time getting my words around them, but that's what that is. Any thoughts on that?
I must say,
Yeah,
Carlos, I must say I've been doing this a long time, and this is the first time I have seen two slides, this one and the previous one, that really help to crystallize and help to get a visual, which many of us need.
Yes.
to talk about these things with any amount of clarity.
And Carl, that's a great point. We need it ourselves internally, like yourself and myself, even though we've been in the business such long. There's so many moving pieces. Like you said, having it crystallized, I think, is important, because it's like when you see it in black and white, you kind of go, oh boy, right? Yep. It's like it's a bit of a shock, I'll say, or something that you kind of realize, makes you think about it.
Once you kind of find yourself, is the way I would say this, on either one of these little charts, now you've got to add in and start talking about, and what about my customizations and my integrations and my add-ons? Where do they fall in this also?
That's
right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. They add another level, of detail to this particular type of approach.
Yeah.
Very nice.
It's extremely important that those be taken into consideration as you just described, because this is just the core base. This is the foundation of your ERP system. All the other pieces that come into play, as you described, those too need to be taken into consideration. And, I'm not an expert in B1 in any way from a B1 application perspective, but from, something as formatted searches, right? And queries need to be taken into consideration. Anything that's been written, like you said, customization, they need to be taken into consideration when discussing, an overall upgrade project and what those interdependencies and the impact and effect that they will have, for sure. One thing that was my last slide. The next one is just some questions that you mentioned, cloud versus on-prem, and really the key thing is that wherever your infrastructure resides, it's important that someone be looking at it constantly and someone managing it constantly. I think one of the things that you and I have been around long enough that we realize is that a lot of people buy this piece of infrastructure, stick it in a closet somewhere in the back, it gets buried and nobody really thinks about it. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And whether it's internally somebody reviewing it, daily, weekly, monthly, for performance, for maintenance, it's like anything else. It's like your car, and I know how much of a car guy you are. It doesn't matter whether you skip you go for maintenance every 5,000 kilometers like you're supposed to. At the end of the day, it's cumulative, meaning that if you miss the 3 out of those 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 kilometer services, you're still going to have to do them. They're all just going to be done at the end, but you miss out on the performance. So it's key that be done. And one of the keys that we offer is with our managed services cloud hosting is that server that is out of sight, out of mind, is completely in sight and on our minds all the time. And it's proactively managed. And I think that's the key, is proactively managing your ERP system, whether it be from an end of life system or just from an ongoing maintenance perspective in general.
Yeah, I would definitely put my 2 cents in there, that I think, too many times over the last 14, 15 years with Vision 33, we have had, customers that have that experience of sort of buying it and forgetting it.
Right.
And the only time it comes to mind is when it breaks down.
That's right.
And that, of course, we will help in those
Of
situations,
course.
but it makes the experience a lot less, well, I don't know if either one's enjoyable, but it certainly makes it unenjoyable if it's a disaster situation as opposed to maintenance.
Yeah,
Um, and that,
absolutely. No different than having a fine-tuned car or
yeah,
a car that, isn't finely tuned, and you go out and try to start it and it doesn't start. Well, there goes
yeah,
the joy of driving it, right?
yeah, exactly. I think, more and more, Carlos, wouldn't you say that this is one of the reasons that some of our, long-term customers, when they are upgrading, they are transitioning to the cloud because of these issues in particular.
Yeah, and that's important to know, because we've talked about a little bit about the transitioning of technology and how things have changed. You know, I've said a few times, been around a long time. If I said to people, I'm going to say 5 years ago, but for sure 10 years ago, that their Microsoft Exchange server, which for some people they may not even know what an Exchange server is, but it was the server that ran everything that currently most people run in the cloud from an email perspective. That's the server that manages all your email, your contacts, all of that communication piece. Well, some of us remember that most people used to have one of those servers sitting in that back closet somewhere.
Yep.
Today, most people do not have an Exchange server locally. They have Microsoft Office 365, which was one of the first, big cloud deployments that people became aware of. And if I said to anyone, "Hey, would you like to trade your Microsoft Office 365 for an Exchange server in your back room?" People would laugh and say, "Like, what are you talking about? First of all, what's an Exchange server?"
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where we need to progress. Is most of us are already exposed to the cloud on our personal devices, but from an ERP system perspective, we need to say, this is a mission critical piece of my business, and I need to have the newest technology infrastructure in place to support it. And to be fair and honest, having that from a physical hardware perspective in your back room, it's not feasible. You can't provide enough dollars and cents or man hours to support it, because a data center is centralized, meaning that whether it's Azure or Google or AWS, this is all they do. Whether it's fire retardant systems, power redundancy, internet communication redundancy, network redundancy, server redundancy. It's almost like you would have to buy two of each to have in your local infrastructure: two sets of firewalls, two sets of switches, two sets of hardwire, two sets of servers, to be able to achieve the same type of redundancy. And never mind that generator that needs to run in the back in case of a power failure, and a satellite connection in case you need to have internet. Right? So these are some of the things that you need to consider when considering what platform you're going to be using and which one it should be. Because the other thing too that we need to be cautious about, Carl, is that not all clouds are the same. Cloud infrastructure has many varying degrees, I'll say, of quality and also expectations that should be delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Carlos, thank you very much for joining us this Wednesday web chat. I think, this is really good information for folks to have. And this is not a bad time of the year for us to talk about these things, because, many of our friends are out there doing annual planning and that sort of thing. And I think
Exactly.
this is a good thought that I would encourage them to think about and put into their annual business plans, to be sure that whatever you were doing in 2022, maybe you do it a little better in 2023 with some of the information that we've been able to pass on to you. So, Carlos, thanks. And
Very welcome.
we'll have you back again next year at some point
There you go. Well, it's a
to
pleasure,
do the
and
same.
all the best of the holidays to you.
Best to you as well, my friend. And to
Take
everyone
care.
else, we'll see you again on the next episode of Wednesday Web Chat.